My great-grandfather was named Newton Harrell, and he was the first white child born west of the Chattahoochee River in Georgia. And his brother went to California during the gold rush and drove several herds of cattle to California and kind of supplied the miners with beef and whatever. He didn't really search for gold, but he ended up with a ranch in Idaho. And his brother went out to visit him. The way he went out was he went on a ship to the Gulf, down to the Gulf of Mexico, to the Isthmus of Panama, and they walked across the Isthmus of Panama, and they were supposed to catch a ship on the other side to go up to California, but when they got there, the ship was already gone. So they built a ship and sailed up the coast to California, visited his brother, and then he got lonesome for his girlfriend back home. So they went back the same way. Went back to Georgia and married his sweetheart. And that's where my grandfather, Ed Harrell, was born. He and his brother came out here in 1890, and they were visiting their brother who lived in Gainesville, Texas. He was a dentist. And then they were going to Colorado fishing. And they came up here on the plains, and the lakes were all full of water, and there were ducks everywhere, and they were never out of sight of an antelope. And they liked it, and they just stayed. And he and his brother was a dentist, and he was the first dentist in Amarillo. And then he later, when he was 40 years old, he thought he was in bad health. So he retired, and then he was 60, he married, and he moved back to Georgia. He lived to be 92. But he and my grandfather came out here together, and they filed on a section of land east of Tulia. And then the next year, they changed the law where they could file on 4 sections of land. And there weren't any open other sections around that one that were open, so they moved over next to Canyon, where there was some open land, and they lived west of Canyon from then until they bought this ranch. And his brother really never was in the cattle business. He was a dentist. And my granddad, when they first got here, they went in the horse business because that was kind of the style at that time. That was what was booming at that time. And then later the horses went down so cheap that they couldn't even give them away. They finally ended up trading for molasses for the last horses. But they loaned some money and got the first cow they got was on a loan they'd made to somebody, and the fellow couldn't pay off the loan, so he gave him a cow, and that was their first cow. But my granddad went in the cow business, and he kind of traded cattle, and they lived west of Canyon. Then he was 30 years old when he married my grandmother. She was 15, and there weren't many women, and he said somebody's going to marry her, so he might as well be the one. And then my dad was born 2 years later when she was just 17. And so they kidded my granddad. They said, yeah, we saw him, his little boy and his little girl in town here the other day. Of course, that was my grandmother and my dad. But they got along well, and then in 1917 they bought this ranch from the J.A. Ranch. They had been leasing land as well as the land that they owned. And at about that time they decided they were having trouble leasing land. And that's the reason they decided to buy this land. In the first few years it was easy to make the payments. But the last few years the cattle prices went down. They had trouble making payments. He didn't intend to buy as big a place. There was another fellow who was going to take half of it. And the other fellow never did make any payments, so my granddad ended up making all the payments. He bought this from Mrs. Adair, who was John Adair's widow, Cornelia Adair. This place was the first ranch in the panhandle of Texas, and it was settled by Charles Goodnight and John Adair. They formed a partnership. John Adair was in Colorado looking for mineral leases, or the first time he came over here was hunting expedition. He liked it, And he met Colonel Goodnight in Colorado, and they formed a partnership and bought some cattle and then drove them down here. 1874 was the last battle with the Indians, and it was fought right here on this place. And that's kind of what opened up the country. As long as the Indians and the buffalo were here, the cattlemen they couldn't come. And the buffalo hunters killed most of the buffalo in about 3 years. So from around 1874, they said that there was a treaty with the Indians that they would shoot no buffalo south of the Arkansas River. Well, anyway, there was after 1874 there was no more buffalo north of the river, so the buffalo hunters moved in. And that's when the Indians went on the warpath. And they killed nearly all the buffalo in the next 3 years. And that's when they had the war, the Mackenzie battle, and all the Indian battles were in 1874. And the Indians then went back to the reservation, and they didn't have any more trouble with the Indians, so they killed the buffalo. And then in 1876, Colonel Goodnight came here to this place and drove the herd of cattle down. There were a few buffalo left in the canyon. They drove the buffalo out and drove the cattle in. And that home ranch was on this ranch where we are.